The night the priestess was born, the swamp held its breath. Cypress knees jutted from the black water like knuckles of a clenched fist, and the moon refused to rise, as if it knew better than to watch. The other women said the child did not cry, because she was listening. Learning the rhythm of frogs, the hiss of insects, the wet pulse of the earth itself. By dawn, 3 chickens lay dead without wounds, and the master's wife woke screaming from a dream she could not remember. They named the girl Marguerite, though the spirits would never call her that. She grew beneath the weight of chains and hymns, beneath lashes that split skin and sermons that promised salvation through obedience. The plantation sat high on the riverbank, white and proud, its columns like teeth sunk into the land. At night, laughter spilled from its windows, while the slave quarters trembled with quiet grief. Marguerite learned early that suffering had a sound, and that it could be answered. She watched her mother bury small bundles at the edge of the swamp, bones wrapped in cloth, herbs tied with hair, whispers fed into the soil. When her mother vanished one humid afternoon, soul beaten or swallowed by the river, Marguerite finished the ritual alone. Something beneath the ground shifted, slow and patient. Years passed. The master aged into cruelty like a second skin. His sons inherited his appetites, his daughters his silence. Marguerite was brought into the house to scrub floors and empty chamber pots. Her eyes lowered, her mouth obedient. But walls speak to those who know how to listen. So do mirrors. So do the dead buried too close to the roots of old trees. The first sign was laughter echoing through empty rooms. Then came the voices, soft at first, calling family members by childhood names no living soul remembered. Sleep fled the house. Horses refused their stalls. The master began to see stains on his hands that water could not wash away. Marguerite stood in the doorway one evening, candlelight trembling in her grasp, and for the first time she met her owner's gaze without fear. In her shadow, something moved that was not human, not entirely spirit, but hungry all the same. The curse did not arrive like thunder. It seeped in, gentle as humidity, inevitable as rot. And once it took hold of the family's blood, it would not let go. No matter how loudly they prayed or how deeply they buried their sins. She was taken from the cane fields on a morning that smelled of rust and rain, her hands still sticky with sap when the overseer called her name. Until then, her world had been narrow, but honest in its cruelty, the burn of the sun, the rhythm of cutting, the whispered prayers traded between breaths. The fields demanded the body and little else. The house, she would soon learn, demanded the soul. When they marched her up the dirt path toward the plantation home, the ground seemed to harden beneath her bare feet, as if the land itself recognized she was crossing a boundary meant to remain sealed. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with perfume and old dust. The walls were thick, painted pale to hide the stains of time, but they carried a memory all their own. Marguerite felt it immediately, a pressure behind the eyes, a faint ringing in the ears, like standing too close to something alive and very large. Her duties were simple at first, scrubbing floors on her knees, polishing silver until her reflection warped back at her, emptying the waste of people who never once learned her face. Yet each task brought her deeper into the house's inner workings, into rooms where voices dropped when she entered and resumed the moment she left, into corridors where portraits watched with unblinking contempt. She learned the family's habits before she learned their names. The master rose before dawn not to pray, but to pace, muttering to himself as if arguing with an unseen guest. His wife locked her bedroom door each night and still slept with a knife under her pillow. The sons laughed too loudly, drank too much, and carried the scent of fear beneath their cologne. The daughters avoided mirrors and flinched at their own reflections, as though expecting them to move first. These were not the mannerisms of a righteous household, no matter how often scripture was read aloud at the dinner table. Marguerite listened. Listening had kept her alive this long. She listened while kneeling in hallways, while standing silently in corners, while pretending not to understand when secrets spilled carelessly into the air. She learned of land stolen through forged papers, of neighbors ruined by false testimony, of children buried without names behind the family chapel. She learned which doors were never opened, and which rooms smelled faintly of iron, no matter how often they were cleaned. At night, when she returned to her quarters, she carried these truths with her like coals wrapped in cloth. Dangerous but warming. The house itself seemed to respond to her presence. Floorboards creaked only beneath her steps. Candles guttered when she passed. Once, while cleaning the master's study, she brushed her fingers along the desk and felt a pulse, slow and deliberate, as if the wood remembered the hands that had gripped it in desperation. She did not recoil. She had been raised among whispers of spirits and shadows, taught that places could hunger, and that pain left behind a residue stronger than blood. Being inside the house stripped away the last of her illusions. The fields had been brutal but impersonal. The house revealed intention. Every cruelty had been chosen, refined, repeated. She understood then that the family's power was not just built on labor, but on buried screams and unanswered pleas, layered year after year like sediment. Knowledge settled into her bones, heavy and irreversible. She was no longer just surviving the plantation. She was witnessing its true shape from the inside, absorbing the patterns of its decay, sensing how tightly its fate was knotted to the land and to the people it consumed, waiting, watching, learning how a structure so proud could be undone from within, one secret, one sin, one breath at a time. At first, the knowledge came to her the way it always had, through fragments and half-remembered songs carried on the night air. In the slave quarters, after the lamps were blown out and the world narrowed to breathing and heat, the elders whispered stories not meant for daylight. Marguerite listened as she always had, her body still, her mind open, absorbing rhythms older than the river. These were not lessons given freely. Each word was weighed, each pause deliberate, as if the spirits themselves leaned close to hear whether she was worthy of what was being shared. One woman taught her the language of roots, how certain plants bent toward sorrow, and others recoiled from it, how to harvest without asking, and how to ask without speaking. Another taught her the names of nights when the veil thinned and the dead grew restless, nights when the ground remembered everything buried within it. From a man who had once been brought from far across the water, she learned that pain could be shaped, guided, made to travel along bloodlines like a current. None of them called it power. They called it responsibility, and they warned her that once claimed, it would never loosen its grip. Marguerite tested what she was given in small, careful ways. A pinch of ash placed beneath a doorstep, and a cruel overseer fell ill with no mark upon him. A whispered phrase breathed into a cup of water, and a woman who could not sleep found rest for the first time in months. Each act left her trembling, not from fear, but from recognition. Something inside her answered these workings eagerly. Like a limb long asleep finally stirred, she began to understand that what flowed through her was not born of anger alone, but of alignment, as if her suffering had tuned her to a frequency others could not hear. The swamp became her sanctuary. Beyond the reach of the plantation, where the air thickened and the ground sucked at the feet, Marguerite found a stillness the house denied her. She brought offerings to the water, to the trees, to the places where the living rarely tread. There she felt watched, not with malice, but with expectation. The spirits did not speak in words. They pressed images into her mind-eye, ropes sinking into mud, mouths opening to scream and filling with insects, mirrors shattering without being touched. She learned which visions were warnings and which were invitations. It was in the swamp that she realized her suffering had not been random. Each loss, each humiliation, each night of unanswered prayer had hollowed her out, making space for something else to take root. The spirits favored the broken not out of cruelty, but practicality. A vessel already cracked did not need to be shattered again. This understanding did not comfort her, but it steadied her. She stopped asking why and began asking how. The house and the swamp began to echo one another. What she learned in one place revealed itself in the other. The secrets she overheard in hushed rooms aligned too neatly with the rituals she was shown, as if the family's sins had been mapped long ago, waiting for the right hands to trace their outline. She realized then that knowledge alone was not enough. Intention shaped outcome, and precision mattered more than force. Margaret felt the weight of choice settle upon her. She could use what she had learned to survive, to protect herself and perhaps a few others, or she could accept the deeper calling pressing at the edges of her thoughts. The spirits did not demand vengeance. They offered balance. The scales, long tipped by cruelty, could be righted, but only by someone willing to carry the consequences. As she stood knee-deep in black water, fireflies blinking like distant stars, Margaret understood that her pain had carved a path, rather than a grave, and that walking it would bind her forever to forces that did not forgive hesitation. The betrayal did not arrive loudly. It came wrapped in routine, disguised as inevitability, delivered by hands that had taken from her before and learned nothing from it. She was summoned to the master's wife's chamber just after dusk. When the house grew restless and shadows stretched long along the walls, the request was spoken gently, almost kindly, and for a moment Margaret believed restraint might finally be shown. Instead, the door was locked behind her, and the air inside the room thickened with old intentions. What was taken that night could not be returned, not by apology, not by prayer, not by death itself. When it was over, she did not scream. She dressed herself carefully, smoothed her hair, and walked back through the halls as if nothing within her had been altered. The family did not notice the change, or if they did, they mistook it for obedience. But something had sealed shut inside her, something that would never open again. Rage would have been simpler. Grief would have been louder. What settled over her instead was clarity, cold and exact, like the moment before a blade meets skin. She did not act immediately. That was the discipline the elders had taught her. Reaction was for the careless. Consequence belonged to the patient. For days she moved through the house as she always had, eyes lowered, steps measured, hands busy with service. At night, however, she began to prepare. She gathered what was needed in silence. Soil taken from the unmarked graves behind the chapel. Water drawn from the bend in the river where drownings were whispered about. Hair collected from brushes left unattended in the family's rooms. Each item was chosen not for symbolism, but for accuracy. This was not to be a curse of fire and spectacle. It was to be a binding, subtle and enduring. On the chosen night, the house slept poorly. Storm clouds pressed low, and the air smelled of rot and metal. Margaret slipped from her quarters and entered the main house through a door she knew would not creak. In the kitchen, she lit no lamp. She did not need light. The ritual she performed was barely visible, made of murmured syllables and small, deliberate movements. She spoke not to gods, but to witnesses, to things that had watched generations of cruelty unfold without answer. She did not ask for madness. She set conditions. She tied the family's blood to memory, ensured that every sin left unacknowledged would resurface in the mind. Warped and relentless, guilt would manifest as voices. Fear would become visions. Love would sour into suspicion. The curse did not strike outward. It turned inward, folding the family against itself until there was no refuge left inside their own thoughts. When the last word was spoken, Margaret cut her palm and let the blood fall onto the gathered items, sealing the work with what remained of her old life. The pain grounded her, but it did not weaken her. If anything, it steadied her hands. She knew then that there would be no undoing what she had done. The spirits accepted the offering without ceremony. The air shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a breath finally released. She left the house before dawn, returning to her place as if nothing had occurred. But the house had already begun to change. Doors opened to empty rooms where someone was certain a figure had just stood. Laughter echoed where no one remained. The master woke with blood under his fingernails and no memory of why. His wife began to hear a child crying from beneath the floorboards. None of it was sudden enough to invite suspicion. That was the elegance of it. Margaret watched as the first threads tightened, as unease crept into voices that had once spoken only command. She felt no triumph, no relief. What she felt was completion, the calm that follows a task done exactly as it must be done. The family had crossed a final line, and she had answered not with chaos, but with order. Reshaping their fate with care and restraint, binding them to the slow unraveling they had so meticulously earned. Madness did not announce itself as a single moment of collapse. It unfolded gently, like a sickness carried in the blood, revealing itself in habits first, then in fractures no one could ignore. The youngest son was the first to show signs, though the family dismissed it as nerves. He claimed to hear singing in the walls late at night, a woman's voice rising and falling in a language he did not understand. When servants checked, they found nothing, yet he grew pale and sleepless, pressing his ear to the plaster, as if afraid to miss something meant only for him. The daughters followed in quieter ways. One began speaking to her reflection, holding long conversations in the mirror, before abruptly covering it with cloth, convinced it was watching her when she turned away. Another woke screaming from dreams in which the river flooded her bed, filling her mouth with black water while unseen hands pulled her under. Their mother blamed weak constitutions and sent for doctors who prescribed tonics and prayer, never noticing how the girl's eyes tracked corners of rooms long after the physicians had gone. The master's decline was slower, more insidious. He became convinced the house itself was accusing him. Floorboards creaked in patterns he insisted were deliberate, spelling his name in a language only he could hear. He scrubbed his hands raw each morning, convinced they were stained. Though no one else saw it, at dinner, he paused mid-sentence, staring into space as if someone had just whispered a secret too terrible to repeat. The man, who once ruled through certainty, began to hesitate, second, guessing every order, every decision, until authority slipped from him like water through fingers. As months turned into years, the madness deepened and spread. Children born into the family carried it from infancy, crying at empty air, refusing to sleep unless lamps were left burning through the night. Some spoke of visitors who came after sunset, relatives long dead who sat at the foot of their beds and asked questions no child should know how to answer. The plantation gained a reputation. Neighbors avoided the house, sensing something wrong even if they could not name it. Weddings were canceled. Business deals dissolved without explanation. The family's influence withered, replaced by whispers and uneasy glances. Marguerite watched from the edges of this unraveling, her face as composed as ever. She did not interfere. The curse required no maintenance. It fed on denial, grew stronger with every attempt to ignore it. Ministers were summoned, then dismissed when prayer failed to quiet the voices. Physicians diagnosed melancholia, hysteria, hereditary weakness, never realizing how close they came to the truth. It was in the blood, but not in the way they understood. The madness did not make the family violent at first. It made them suspicious. Brothers accused sisters. Mothers questioned the paternity of their own children. Letters were hidden, then burned. Trust decayed until even moments of tenderness were poisoned by doubt. Love became a liability, something that could be used, twisted, turned against its bearer. The house grew silent as family members withdrew into separate rooms, afraid of one another, afraid of themselves. Eventually, the isolation bred desperation. Some tried to flee, packing trunks in the night, only to find themselves paralyzed by panic before reaching the gates, convinced the land itself would not let them go. Others turned to drink, to laudanum, to anything that promised quiet, if only for a few hours. A few ended their own lives, unable to bear the ceaseless pressure of memories that were not entirely theirs, but felt intimately so. Through it all, Marguerite remained untouched. She moved through her days, tending to her work, aging slowly, as if time treated her differently. The spirits kept their distance now, their task complete, leaving the family to face the slow, generational erosion of their minds. What had begun as private torment became a legacy, passed down with the estate, ensuring that no heir would inherit the land, without also inheriting the weight of every unacknowledged cruelty, every silenced scream, every sin left to rot in the dark, until the name itself became synonymous with ruin and no one could remember when the madness had truly begun. Long after the last member of the family was laid into the ground, the plantation refused to die. The house sagged, its white paint peeling away to reveal gray wood beneath, but it did not collapse. Vines crept along the columns, and the roof caved in places, yet the structure endured as if held upright by something other than nails and beams. Locals said the land remembered too much to let the place vanish entirely. At night, lights were sometimes seen flickering in windows that no longer had glass, and the river nearby grew unnaturally still when the moon rose high. Marguerite was said to have disappeared before the end, though no one could agree on how. Some claimed she walked into the swamp one morning and never returned, her footprints stopping abruptly at the water's edge. Others insisted she remained on the land until old age, becoming thinner and quieter each year, until she simply blended into the shadows of the trees. There were those who believed she died and was buried without marker or prayer, her body claimed by roots and insects, her spirit bound forever to the soil she had shaped with blood and intention. The truth, like so much else, refused to settle into a single form. What endured was her name, spoken carefully and never loudly. Travelers passing through the region heard it in half, finished sentences, in warnings offered without explanation. Children dared one another to approach the old grounds at dusk, to call out and see who would answer. Those who tried said the air grew thick and close, as if the land leaned inward to listen. Some swore they heard a woman humming, low and steady, the sound carrying no emotion, only certainty. The curse, if it could still be called that, did not fade with the bloodline's end. It changed. The madness no longer clung to a single family, but the place itself. People who lingered too long on the grounds reported dreams that did not belong to them, visions of rooms they had never seen, arguments whispered into their ears by voices that knew their names. A few left in a hurry, shaken and pale, unable to explain why they felt suddenly burdened by guilt they could not place. Others stayed, drawn by an unspoken pull, convinced the land had something important to reveal if they were patient enough. Scholars and skeptics came and went, recording stories, dismissing them, returning years later with new theories and the same unease. No explanation satisfied. The swamp resisted mapping. Paths shifted overnight. Compasses failed. It was as if the land itself chose who was allowed to understand and who was meant only to witness. The more the place was studied, the more it seemed to withdraw, guarding its history with a quiet, deliberate stubbornness. Some said Marguerite had never intended to destroy the land, only to ensure it would never be innocent again. That anyone who tried to claim it, without acknowledging what had been done, there would feel the weight of that denial pressing inward. Others believed she had become something else entirely, no longer bound to human time or form, listening from beneath the roots and water, waiting for new injustices to take shape. In this telling, the curse was not finished, merely resting. Even now, when the river floods and the swamp spreads wide, people speak of seeing a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching with an expression neither cruel nor kind. Those who meet her gaze feel an unmistakable sense of being measured, as though some unseen scale were tipping, deciding whether balance was needed once more. The wind carries the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves, and with it, the understanding that certain wrongs never truly pass into history. They sink instead into the ground, into memory, into places where someone is always listening, waiting for the moment when a name is spoken with the wrong intention, and the land remembers how to answer.